Hello and welcome back to Deep Sleep Creep's YouTube channel. Today we're going to be listening to fall horror stories mostly taking place in the woods. These reported encounters will primarily be that of a skinwalker or dogman related. So please sit back, get comfortable, and let's go deep. This story happened just last November. I'm only now getting around to writing it down. I would consider myself an outdoors man. I grew up in the sticks. I've spent a lot of my life wandering in and enjoying the backcountry. I'm older now and have settled down in the suburbs. Wife, 2 boys, a house, a dog, a desk job, the whole suburban 9 yards. I want opportunities for my kids that come from suburban life, but I also want them to grow up with an appreciation for the outdoors. So when my oldest son was big enough for his first solo father-son camping trip, I was excited. My wife and younger son stayed home for this mid-fall trip. It was going to be a great bonding experience for me and my son. Because my son is just 5, I didn't want to do anything too extreme on our first big solo camping trip. We needed a place that wasn't too deep into the Colorado Front Range, but still allowed for dispersed camping. I don't consider camping in RV parks or established campgrounds to be actual camping. You might as well be at a motel watching TV. Camping at most is a tent, sleeping bag and a fire. A dispersed camping area called Gordon Gulch, west of Boulder, caught my attention. I'd never been to this area before. There were no facilities and it was dispersed enough you couldn't see or hear other campers nearby. My son and I had a blast that day. We set up camp, collected firewood, went for a hike, saw a moose and a bobcat, tried a little fishing, and finally, as the sunlight faded, we returned to our campsite to light a fire. We had a traditional and nutritious camping meal of fire-burned hot dogs and marshmallows. It was a good day, definitely a core memory for both my son and me, the perfect first camping experience for a preschooler, or so I thought. I was catapulted out of the void of sleep. Not sure what aroused me, I sat up collecting myself. The world seemed to be at peace. It was quiet, just me and the breeze through the treetops. I couldn't figure out what woke me so suddenly. The sound of my son laughing in his sleep cut through my groggy confusion. It was a deep belly laugh. Must be a fun dream, I thought hazily. Gently rocking him was enough to quiet him down. That must have been what startled me, I determined. As I repositioned to fall back to sleep, my son burst out laughing. I sighed and closed my eyes. He'll quiet down soon enough, I thought. He laughed again. This time his laugh was echoed by something outside our tent. I held my breath and listened, unsure of what I just heard. It wasn't an echo. There was something out there and it was laughing in unison with my son. My grogginess vanished as the adrenaline began to pump. It couldn't be real. It had to be my imagination. I sat up in my sleeping bag listening to the night. Hearing nothing after a minute, my muscles relaxed. I started to settle back down. Must have been hearing things. I was tired after all. Checking the time, I saw it was 4 in the morning. The sun would be up in a couple hours. My son laughed again. And again it was answered with laughter outside. I was now absolutely certain it was not an echo. As I tried to make sense of what was happening, the voice outside called out my son's name. My blood ran cold. That voice, it was so familiar. Then it clicked in my brain. It was the voice of my younger son. That wasn't at all possible. He was safe at home with my wife, miles and miles away. I could hear twigs crunching beyond our thin nylon tent walls. It was impossible to tell the distance from us. But there was something out there, circling us. Unprompted this time, it called out my son's name in that little toddler voice. My 5-year-old, still fast asleep, called out to his brother asking him to play. The thing outside the tent laughed in reply and urged my son to come outside. That thing with my little son's voice sounded cold, hollow, dead. The floodgates of my adrenaline burst open. Cold sweat formed on my face. I was frightened out of my mind, but my primal caveman brain roared to life. I was in Papa Bear mode. Nothing was going to take or hurt my son. I was putting a stop to this. Whatever it was out there, I didn't care. You don't mess with my kids. Say what you will, but when you're camping miles from anything, it's not worth the risk of being unarmed. Wild animals, wild people, you have to be prepared. I almost always take a firearm with me when I'm camping. Pepper spray and bear bells are great, but nothing gets attention from a conscious threat faster than the sound of chambering around. I spoke loudly into the night that I had a gun and was coming out. I hoped the fear in my voice was masked by my aggressiveness. The only reply was the breeze through the treetops. My son was still asleep. Kid's a hard sleeper. Another trait from his mom. My wife and I have joked that he could sleep through a tornado. Stepping out into the cool November night, a gun in one hand and a flashlight in the other, I surveyed the campsite. The fire was down to embers. Our fishing gear was leaning against the pickup. The firewood was still neatly stacked. Nothing seemed out of place. The voice called out, this time from behind, and this time focused towards me. "Daddy, Daddy!" It was my youngest son's voice again, crying out for me from the dark forest. I threw the light beam in that direction. A pair of shimmering green eyes were illuminated by my flashlight. They were only 2 or so feet above the ground, the same height as a toddler. I took a small step toward it. I wanted to see more. I needed to see more. The eyes, unblinking, remained in place. Getting closer didn't help reveal this thing. It seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, almost devouring it. I couldn't make out its size or shape or color. It seemed to swallow up all the light around it, save for its 2 shimmering green eyes. That thing laughed in its hollow toddler's voice, this time with malice and cruelty in it. The eyes never looked away from me, never blinking, focused only on me, like a predator before the pounce. Not wanting to give up any ground to a predator, I stepped forward again. It didn't move. Not knowing what to do, I screamed as loud as I could. I waved my arms, trying futilely to shoo it away. The eyes shimmered, and as I stared back, the eyes shifted from green to amber. I watched as they began to rise up into the air. It was now apparent to me this thing had been crouching and was now standing up. I could only watch in silent terror as the eyes finally stopped rising, nearly 10 feet off the ground. The night air erupted with a deep growl. I could feel the vibrations in my guts. I couldn't see a mouth, but I could hear teeth snapping and gnashing. My son in the tent behind me began to scream. That was the only time the eyes lost focus on me and shifted towards the screams of my kid. My only reaction was to fire my gun into the air. The eyes immediately vanished. My ears were ringing, but I could hear the growls turn to shrieks, followed by a cacophony of crashing branches and undergrowth. I stood there until I couldn't hear the shrieking anymore. It trailed off deep into the trees. I was left with only the sound of the breeze in the treetops and the quiet sobbing of my child. Twilight was beginning to illuminate the forest. Shaking and exhausted, I sat down in the dirt in front of the tent. I tried to collect myself. "Daddy, Daddy, where are you?" my 5-year-old shouted. That got me out of my daze. I picked myself up and went into the tent to retrieve him. Putting him in the truck, I locked the doors and wasted little time breaking down camp. We were out of that camp and back on the road by the time the sun broke over the horizon. I have no idea what is in those woods. I do plan to camp in that area again, albeit without my family, and definitely with some friends. I want to find out more about this thing. Thankfully, my son doesn't seem fazed by anything that happened that night. He thinks I was chasing a bear away from the camp. And maybe he's right. I hope he is anyway. My son can't wait to go on another camping trip. But truthfully, I'm thinking the next family camping trip might be at an RV park, or even a motel. That's family camping, right? I woke up around 2 a.m. a week ago, groggy and disoriented, to prepare for my usual night shift. I noticed that my cat, Oscar, who typically sleeps at the foot of my bed, had left in the middle of the night. This wasn't unusual, but the door to my room was closed with no other way out. Puzzled, I quickly searched the room, but after being unable to find him, I figured my older sister had whisked the poor cat away to her room. No big deal. I thought. I finished preparing and was ready to head out. But just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard a soft hiss coming from my room. I marched back in, now convinced Oscar was just hiding somewhere out of sight. Peering under the bed, I discovered Oscar, huddled at the far end of the bed behind an assortment of shoeboxes. His fur stood on end. I'd never seen him behave like this before. After calling out to him for a few minutes, trying to gently coax him out to no avail, I worried that something was terribly wrong with Oscar. I made an awkward attempt to crawl under the bed and try pulling him out. While I was not particularly fond of cats, Oscar had always been a quiet and gentle companion to me since my childhood. He had never scratched me, or anyone else for that matter. Yet for the first time, as I reached out to him, he let out a deep guttural hiss and slashed my arm, leaving a deep gash. Shocked, I retreated from under the bed. I was bleeding a lot more than I would have expected, with a mix of frustration from the sudden violence and panic at the sight of blood all over my arm and clothes. I realized I probably wasn't going to make it to work on time. I quickly texted my boss, letting them know I would be late, before tending my wound, cleaning myself up, and getting changed. Oscar was still hiding under the bed, and just as I was about to try coaxing him out again, I heard a knock on the front door. What the hell? Who knocks on people's doors at 2 a.m? I muttered to myself, perplexed and slightly unnerved. I stepped into the hallway, moving cautiously towards the door. Through the frosted window I could see a somewhat familiar figure standing there, eerily motionless. My heart pounded as I slowly approached. That's when I heard a voice. "Hey, it's me, let me in." The voice in the dead of night sent shivers down my spine. But the most chilling part was the familiarity of the voice itself. It was my voice. The figure on the other side of the door was unmistakably me. "Hey, it's me, let me in," it repeated firmly, now knocking more insistently. Fear set in as I realized that any of my family members would have fallen for this. I was supposed to have left for work by now. Trembling, I began to back away from the door. The figure inched closer, attempting to peer through the frosted window. As it did, I could begin to discern the blurry details on my face. Our eyes locked, and for a brief moment it seemed surprised. But then it smiled. The most sinister, unnerving smile. A smile that I would never make. In that bone-chilling moment, it silently backed away from the door and vanished into the night. Needless to say, I never made it to work that night, or any night since. My family thinks I'm crazy for locking myself away in my room, telling me it was just some sort of prank. But since that day, every sleepless night I've had listening to my cat hiss from under the bed convinces me otherwise. This creepy encounter happened one night when my girlfriend's sister and I went down to the river beach near my college. My girlfriend and I do this frequently, and yesterday my younger sister came up to visit for the night, so we decided to take her down to the little beach on the side of the river that runs through campus to have a fire and hang out. When walking out to the beach, there's about a 20 to 35 minute walk through the woods. When walking down to the beach, we stayed on the trail and had no issues at all. We hung out on the beach for about an hour and a half before we decided we wanted to head back and watch a movie in my and my girlfriend's dorm. When walking back, we happened to lose the trail as everything was covered in leaves. An important aspect of this story is that there is a clearing where power lines run almost halfway between the beach and the street at the beginning of the trail. This clearing consists of tall grass and pricker bushes that make it difficult to cross if not on the one trail through it. A little while before this clearing, we lost the trail. We had the idea to walk straight in the direction of the clearing, and once we found it, we would walk alongside it until we found the cut-through trail. Now it was dark, so we all had our phone flashlights on, and my little sister was even playing music on her phone. We were calm and didn't think much of it. We found the clearing and started walking along the side of it, trying to find the trail. My girlfriend was a few feet behind my sister, and when I heard the music my sister was playing, I heard a branch snap coming from deeper in the woods. I told my sister to turn off her music and began scanning the area. I thought I heard the noise come from with my light. At first I didn't see anything, and when my girlfriend asked me what it was, I said nothing and continued trying to find the trail. I was still slightly uneasy, so I continued scanning the direction I heard the noise come from with my light. I noticed something white, with what appeared to be ears, standing very still in the direction I heard the noise come from. I couldn't tell if it was some type of animal or just something that looked like an animal. I didn't say anything for a second because I assumed my eyes were playing tricks on me as I couldn't see any eyes reflecting my light. This thing was about 15 to 20 feet away, so I assumed if it was an animal I would see its eyes reflecting my light. It was also standing very still, so I believed my eyes were playing tricks on me. I moved my light for a second to continue looking for the trail, and when I shined it back in the direction of that thing, I saw it violently swaying back and forth. I said, "What the F is that?" and turned around when my sister looked and screamed, "Why is it moving like that?" I've never heard my sister sound so scared, so I yelled to my girlfriend and sister to run. We ran straight through the tall grass and pricker bushes until we came out the other side. My sister fell and lost both of her shoes. I helped her up and told her to forget the shoes, and we all continued running in the direction we believed the trail to be. Thankfully, we eventually found the trail again and didn't stop running until we got out of the woods. When we got back on the street, we all calmed down and began talking about what we saw. I saw it first and knew something was off when I saw it swaying back and forth. It was very unnatural, and I can only describe it as it looked limp, sort of like a slinky. It didn't look like something a human could do. My girlfriend and sister saw it after I turned to look for the way out. They both said it began charging at us, and it was still swaying like that while coming at us. This was unbeknownst to me at the time. I never saw it charge at us, so learning this information made it even scarier. Even weirder, we all never saw its face and couldn't fully make out its shape. My girlfriend and sister both did say it was running on two legs and was upright like a person, but was moving in a way that didn't seem possible for someone to move. The whole thing doesn't make any sense, and we've been trying to explain it ever since it happened, but no scenario we can think of makes any sense. To make it even scarier, my girlfriend mentioned how when we first got to the beach, she heard someone walking in the woods behind her as my sister and I were busy getting the fire started. This could be totally unrelated, but the thought of this person or thing watching us the whole time we were there really freaked us out. If anyone has any idea what this might have been, please feel free to share your insight, as we are all completely stumped. This happened many years ago in November. My son was approaching his 10th birthday and always wanted to go hunting with me. In the state of Colorado, you needed to be at least 12 years old to get your youth hunting regulation license. My son, however, begged me for years that he wanted to shoot for his 10th birthday, and I finally said yes. He was going to get his youth hunting regulation license soon, and I thought it would be good to practice with him that year. I decided between many guns, but the one I settled on was the rifle semi-auto carbine like the Ruger 10-20 Myself and my wife wanted our kids to be more outdoors people and seek adventure more, since their generation is constantly on their phones and video games, that we didn't want that type of lifestyle for our kids as well. My wife hesitantly agreed when I convinced her to get him a rifle for his November birthday. Since legally speaking he would need to be at least 12 years old to hunt with me, we decided we were going to have to be really careful of other hunters out in the woods. Which is why for the Thanksgiving month, I decided to take him out turkey hunting and camping. Seems like a small and fun activity at the time. I, however, wanted to go to a different forest this time, away from the typical big game hunters and far away from people or civilization in general, so that my son had the freedom to shoot. And I didn't need to worry about anything such as him accidentally shooting people, which I knew he wouldn't because he's a careful boy, but you never know. This also includes away from well-known campsites. We were going into a forest I've never been in before, but I heard it was quiet. Nobody went there, and there were a good amount of turkeys, deer and other wildlife. I wish I saw the red flags of why no one would go there earlier, but I'm lucky we made it out alive. When my son opened up his birthday present, he was gleefully excited to receive a rifle that he jumped up and down and screamed happily. He wanted to go hunting then and now. and I told him we have to wait for cake first, then we can go hunting early in the morning. But I allowed him to shoot a couple rounds in our backyard as practice, teaching him the basics of safety before our long hike the next morning. Once we got done singing happy birthday and eating cake, we discussed our plans for the next day and started packing. The next morning at the dawn of dusk, we got in my truck and went to the woods and started our long hike in the unknown woods. With our guns and our hiking backpacks, around a couple of miles into our hike is when we saw turkeys and started slowly following them. Once we were at a good shooting distance, I taught my son to stay low to the ground and slowly stalk and aim for the turkeys. One shot and he missed. It's okay, better luck next time. My son looked disappointed as most of the turkeys ran off. Then we started following and waiting for some more turkeys to show up. As we sat in silence, focusing on our scope, my son shot again. This time he did get a turkey. "Nice shot," I said. "Thanks, Dad," he responded. We grabbed the turkey and tied it up and attached it to ourselves. Then once again we got to our waiting positions. My son shot something. I turned around to look at what he shot at. Oh geez, it was a person. My heart started pounding and I felt sick to my stomach until I realized luckily my son was a bad aim and missed the person since it was still standing from a far distance. "What the hell, John?" I asked. My son stared at the thing and went pale. "What?" I asked, frustrated and concerned all at the same time. He broke out of his trance and said, "Dad, I swear it was hunched over in the fields and has antlers, so I thought it was an elk or bulk or deer. But then it just stood up. What kind of animal does that?" I have bad far distance eyesight, so I relied on my scope, attached to my gun a lot because it was specially made for my eyesight. I looked through my scope this time and sure enough my son was right. It was standing and had antlers on its head. It looked at us with complete death and evil glare. It had what I can best describe as a hollowed out deer face. No eyeballs either, just two black holes in its place. I froze in my tracks. I didn't know what to say or do. I had an intense feeling like we didn't belong there, like we were intruding on its turf. I decided we should end our hunting trip here. We grabbed our dead turkeys and started hiking to a nearby pond we noticed on our hike up here. We slowly moved and started walking away, staring at it and it staring at us. It wasn't making any movements. It was just watching us as we moved away. I knew with the amount of camping equipment we had left to carry, and my son's little legs, we weren't going to be able to trek far. Luckily, I did have a handgun, big knife and a flare gun in case maybe this thing is afraid of light. In all my years of hunting, I've seen every animal you can think of. Or so I thought. I wasn't quite sure anymore. We eventually got to the pond area and set up camp there. We haven't seen it in a while since we left it back there in the woods. My son kept asking questions that I had no idea how to respond to, like the award-winning question of what the F is that? We put the turkeys in our cooler and started cooking over the fire what my wife prepared. A packet of mixed vegetables, potatoes and seasoned meat in case my son didn't catch anything. My son kept questioning me on what that was. I still did not have an answer. That night we were going to sleep in separate tents, but my son agreed it would be better if we stuck together for the night and leave the next morning. After dinner we set up our big tent and watched as the sun set, creating a peaceful atmosphere. I remembered it being extremely foggy that day, especially as the sun was setting over the horizon. Bummer, I thought. It would have been nice to see the stars with my son. Next time, I thought. I started resting in the chairs outside of the tent with my son and told him all the crazy stories my buddies and I did while we were hunting. I told him all the fun camping and hunting stories I had in front of our little fire pit while we roasted marshmallows for our s'mores. One such fun story was being chased by a bull with my buddies. Apparently they don't like being shot at too much, and we were laughing and practically forgot about the creepy experience and finally enjoyed our mini trip. That was until around 11 p.m. the night was silent. We were enjoying the fire pit and watching it go out as my son drifted off to sleep until he noticed it too. It was quiet. Too quiet. To the point all the bugs, the crickets, the hooting of an owl, all of the sudden stopped. I immediately had a bad feeling because this usually happens when there's a predator nearby when nature goes dead silent like that. I took my handgun out of the holster and my flare gun close by me when I told my son to get in the tent now and to bring his gun. He did immediately without any questions, which I'm very proud of. That he didn't break the first rule of hunting, which was to do what I say without question when we were in a potentially dangerous situation. Him safe and secure in the tent, I took out my flashlight and started scanning the woods. I started scanning the woods for about a minute or two all around me and saw nothing. I kind of breathed a sigh of relief until I heard it. I heard my wife's voice calling out to my son John. It was her voice, but very distorted, almost like a bad recording. No emotion behind it, just my son's name in my wife's voice. A big chill went down my spine along with goosebumps and hair standing up on the back of my neck. I glared my flashlight to the direction where the voice was coming from, and there it was. That creature again. It looked so evil and menacing. My son, in response, started slowly opening the tent. "Stop!" I yelled at him. "That's not your mum. You stay in there right now." Once again he did as he was told and stayed in the tent, silent. I knew he was scared, and so was I. I was in a standoff with a creature I had never seen before. "I have a gun!" I yelled at it, but it started coming closer and closer. "Stop right there!" I pointed my gun at it, and it seemed like it was mocking me because it then repeated my own voice and said, "Stop right there!" Again in that distorted, emotionless voice. I didn't know what to do. I was stunned. What kind of creature did that? How did it mimic my voice too? I stayed frozen and pointed my gun at it for an hour, and it stayed still in that same position for an hour too. We were having a standoff. All I could think about was that I was going to protect my son at all costs. I was not going to let this thing get to him. Some creatures were afraid of light, the others sound. So I did something that was probably dumb and took my flare gun out and shot it in the air. Bright light came out and exposed the shadows of the darkness and brought it to the light. The thing did not like that very much as it scurried away and hid in the shadows. I yelled, "The next one will go right in your head." After a moment of silence, the nature noises returned. The creature was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief and comforted my son, crying. We were both so scared. I didn't cry because I wanted to be brave for him. I wanted to be his rock, even though I felt extremely helpless still against this creature. The flare gun may have stopped it now, but will it return later tonight? I mean, it's only midnight. I decided to stay outside with my gun and watch the woods in case that thing comes back, all while my son went to sleep. I don't know how he could, but he did. Still awake with adrenaline, I was able to stay up all night long in case that thing returned. Once the sun finally rose above the horizon, I woke up my son and we packed and left the woods for good. We finally got to my truck and drove off. I told my wife about it, and at first she didn't believe me, but when she saw how scared I was recounting my experience, and my son confirming what I said, she believed us, and told us never to return back there again. I was going to suggest the same thing. The important thing was, we were both alive. The next day I told my good hunter friend my experience at a local diner. I grabbed coffee with him to talk about it. I told him what I saw, what happened, its strange voice and how it was able to mimic my wife's voice and mine. My friend Jimmy went quiet and was listening to my story, but also seemed like he had his own memory that he was remembering while staring out the window. I asked him, "What is this creature?" He turned and said, "People say it might be a skinwalker." Yes, I had this same experience with my daughter. She wanted to try hunting and we also experienced this. I started to get red in the face with my voice slightly elevated and asked, "You didn't think to warn me before I brought my son with me?" I started to get up and leave until he calmly but sternly said, "Would you have believed me?" Jacket at hand, I froze on my heels, thinking honestly to myself, No, I wouldn't have, and sat back down. Then he explained to me everything. How that was the skinwalker's land, and a lot of hunters don't want to admit it, but that's why none of them ever hunt there. It was a long, shocking conversation, but that's what happened. I understand if no one believes me. I don't even believe in myself sometimes. Who knows? Maybe my friend and I are both crazy. I do know for sure I will never be returning to those types of woods again. I've always loved my job as a landscaper or lawn care specialist. I make my own hours, get to work outdoors, and best of all, I get to embrace my passion. I view lawn care as much more of an art form like architecture, because no two trees, lawns, hedges or ponds are the same. When you're a landscaper, you basically take the nature equivalent of raw material and craft it into something unique. That's why I view it more like an art form than just cutting the grass, and there is no telling what you may encounter while working. I thought I knew that until my last job. By far the busiest times of year in this line of work are spring and fall. Spring, because after winter the grass and plants are finally starting to bloom and need tons of attention, especially because of the frequent rain. And fall, because it's the final bit of time to keep an eye on things before the months-long cold of winter makes my job irrelevant. I'm usually pretty busy in the summer depending on the weather, because I either have to work hard to make sure grass on lawns doesn't dry out in the heat, or there is no shortage of lawns to mow if it's a rainy summer. But fall also means that in addition to the usual landscaping tasks, there are leaves to rake, which was just fine with me. I've always loved raking leaves, as I find it calming, and the vivid colours on the trees give you plenty to look at while you're working. Most of my clients are long-time customers, so much so that we can communicate very easily as I know what they expect of me by now. But of all my customers, my favourite land to work belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Anderson. They have a large stone house with double doors and blue shutters, and the property is set on 7 acres with a solid blend of all kinds of trees. Lots of pine trees and plenty of beautiful maple and other trees that shed their leaves come fall. And I was due there for a job on a lovely October evening. It was a short drive there, and on the way, I passed numerous storefronts with orange lights or cobwebs in the windows before I arrived at the Anderson neighbourhood. It's filled with people who are actually pretty cool and friendly. That's one reason the neighbourhood is one of the most prized places to go trick-or-treating around here. All the houses are spaced pretty close together. There's plenty of sidewalk and the homeowners get really into the holiday spirit. All down the street were houses decorated in their own unique ways. One was covered with cobwebs and a giant spider, while others were filled with a cemetery, an open coffin, and a collection of monsters. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson kept it simple with plenty of orange lights, pumpkins and some dried corn stalks arranged around the garage. Once I parked in the driveway, I got out of my truck, got everything ready and got started on my job. First, I mowed the front lawn. There is nothing like the smell of freshly cut grass on a refreshing fall morning, and when that was done, it was time for me to take care of the leaves. It was early October, and the trees in the backyard were only beginning to shed their leaves. So raking them all out from under the trees where the mower couldn't get them only took about half an hour, and all of them could fit into a small pile. The Andersons always like me to mulch their leaves, which works for me. So I got the mower ready and methodically went about turning the leaves in the backyard into tiny piles that wouldn't cover the grass. When I was done, the smell of leaves coated the air. Also on the schedule today was for me to plant some mums, which was always a big request for me once fall arrived. When that was all said and done, I went home and had a grilled cheese sandwich and some soup for lunch. Several days later, I had an appointment with the Jackson family, who lived next door to the Andersons, so I went right on schedule and took care of their lawn. They generally had fewer trees in their backyard than the Andersons' house, but they were bigger, and their leaves were generally falling at a faster rate. There was a bit of fog that morning that hung thickly in the air, and when I arrived, I could see the grass and the leaves scattered on it were soaked with dew. The Jacksons liked me to use a leaf blower and bag up their leaves, so that task quickly took up to 2 hours. As I worked, I could see the one tree that was technically on the Anderson property, but would occasionally drop leaves on the Jackson property. Thankfully, it wasn't a big deal. The two families got along great and had been friendly for decades. I've met far too many families where a leaf falling on their property from a tree that wasn't theirs was a huge problem. Farther down in the yard, Mr. Jackson was reading a book by his fire ring, which had a fire lit in it and was crackling along in the gentle breeze. The smell from it casually billowed my way, and made the fall air with the crisp breeze and earthy smell of leaves that much more invigorating. Definitely a pleasant atmosphere to finish my work in. The next day was one of those rainy October days where you can feel that fall has arrived. It was grey and rainy all day, and everywhere I drove you could see evidence that the steady rain had caused numerous trees everywhere to shed leaves that had thus far managed to stay on the branches. Although I spent the day indoors watching scary movie marathons, I was mentally gearing up for the inevitable post-rainstorm calls that would arrive as soon as things dried up. Sure enough, the very next day the calls came in to repair one thing or another, and out I went to tidy things up. No matter how old I get, it never ceases to amaze me the difference just a few days can make for how fall can look and feel. The colour creeping into the trees was much more noticeable, with a particularly vivid red making itself known on a tree in the Andersons' yard that I could spot when I drove past it. Later that week, there was a nasty storm with intense rain and wind that caused numerous trees to fall, which meant I was constantly being called out to help get rid of tree limbs that had been snapped off in the wind, or help cut up trees that had broken in half or been uprooted. One of the many trees damaged from wind was one of the massive ones in the Jacksons' yard. Once I arrived, I took out the necessary equipment and carefully went to work on the fallen tree limb. It was a massive branch, but steadily the fallen limb became a pile of firewood as I worked under the bright blue sky. I worked until the sun started to dip behind the orange and red foliage. As I finished up, the sun was slowly descending and the mellow autumn light was peeking out from the gaps in the trees, a sight I never got tired of. I had just finished up with one section and was heading to the other side of the yard to get the last bit of tree that had fallen. The final bit of fallen tree was right in the middle of the yard where the surface was flat. As I stepped on it, I could tell how soft and wet the ground still was. But as I took another step, I felt something snap, and before I knew what was happening, I was falling through the earth. Moments later, pain shot through my body as I landed on rocky ground. I waited for a moment before getting up. Fortunately, I always keep a tool belt filled with tools on me whenever I work, so I quickly removed a flashlight and switched it on. Thankfully, it worked. I checked my phone, which was fine, but there was no service down here. But I was able to shine my flashlight up and see the hole I had fallen through. Thanks to the rain, the soil had thinned out and revealed that right under that section of the Jacksons' yard was the entrance to a tunnel that someone had placed a board over. No doubt all the years of rain and other types of weather had worn it down, so that by the time of the recent heavy rain it had been ready to crack when I stepped right on it. Oh well, nothing I could do about it now. The Jacksons were out for the evening, which meant I had no reason to stick around and try to get their attention, especially since there was no way for me to climb out the way I'd fallen in. So that meant I had to follow the small tunnel I found myself in to wherever it led. It was big enough for me to stand in, and in reasonably good condition. No signs of a cave-in. I could feel how the chill had soaked into the earth as I kept walking. There was no telling where I was going or what I would find. All I could do to get out was keep going forward. Several minutes later, the tunnel opened into a cavern, and I realized I was in an abandoned mine. The tools and cart left behind were the giveaway. It wasn't exactly a surprise. I've lived in Pennsylvania my whole life, and there are old mines everywhere, and I've been in several of them before, so I wasn't exactly shocked or afraid as I followed it along. After the work on the Jacksons' yard and the amount of walking I'd done to get this far, I could feel how my body was soaked with sweat under my jacket. But the air here wasn't as chilly as it was above ground, so that helped cool me down at least somewhat. Eventually the tunnel I was walking in narrowed a bit, and the intense darkness of the mine began to fade. Then the tunnel got lighter and lighter, until I was facing a small ladder built into the cavern wall that went up, and beyond that, there was light coming from somewhere above. I switched off my flashlight and carefully climbed the old wooden steps, silently hoping they wouldn't give way. They held just fine, and when I pulled myself up the last step, I found myself facing a small opening in the rock wall that I could just barely fit through. That was where the light had been coming from. I took a deep breath and carefully stepped through it. As I did, I could smell the fresh air and relief flooded through my body. But that was immediately followed by confusion. On the other side of the opening in the rock wall was a wide stretch of open space that was surrounded by trees. From the outside, the rock wall looked like a small remnant of a quarry built into the earth. But the open space wasn't exactly open because it was filled with RVs, but they were not all of a similar type, like you would expect in a standard storage space. Far from it, as it seemed like every possible model or design was here. Giant RVs and tiny ones that looked older than I was, ones that looked brand new, ones that you could see at any campground, and ones you never saw aside from in old vintage family home movies. I slowly started walking through the rows of vehicles. They seemed to go on forever, and it wasn't long before I had the sensation that I was lost in some kind of endless abyss. It was nighttime by now, and my small flashlight was the only source of light. I was walking on cement, which meant that there were no footprints I could follow. But the upside was that I didn't have to worry about leaving them either. As I kept walking on the cement, I remembered that there used to be a factory somewhere around here, and it was demolished years ago. I guess the floor was all that was left. Seeing all the RVs sitting there, silent and abandoned, was downright creepy, especially because this wasn't some brightly lit warehouse. This was outside in the dark, and the faint light from my flashlight dancing over the various vehicles gathered here made it all the more unnerving. There was something seriously not right about all this. For starters, it wasn't like this was an actual storage space for a business that sold them. I'd heard of graveyards for ships, to say nothing of junkyards, but not RVs. And it wasn't like all these RVs were situated in a public space where anyone could come and look. No. These were hidden away in a place people didn't come looking, and I had no doubt it was for a good reason. For a fleeting moment, I thought that maybe this was part of some haunted attraction for the Halloween season. But I know all the haunted houses around, and there was nothing like this.
Plus, there were no Halloween decorations around, and these giant luxury RVs were not the type to be used in a haunted house. So, the only idea left was that something was up here, and it wasn't good. Especially because, as I took a closer look at all the RVs assembled here, it was clear that for all their differences, they had something in common. They had all sustained some kind of small damage. One vintage RV had a broken front window, while I saw a smashed-in side door on one of the giant expensive RVs, and the list went on and on. The sight of a windshield on a relatively new one that had been completely destroyed sent a particular chill up my spine. If all these RVs had sustained damage, then the logical thing that should have happened was for them to be repaired and returned. None of the damage I could see made them uninhabitable. As someone who maintains people's property as his job, none of this seemed right.
I slowly walked on, trying to get my bearings. The space seemed endless, and I carefully wandered along looking at everything until I passed an average modern RV that I've seen plenty of my friends use on vacation. As I passed the door, I shined my flashlight, and the beam of light highlighted that something was on the door's window. I paused for a closer look and saw that it looked like a handprint, and it was made by what looked just like blood. The sight made my stomach sick with fear. Now there was no doubt I needed to get out of here, and fast. Almost if on cue, I heard a sound from far off in the distance, and from all the time spent in nature, I could tell it was a car driving on gravel. Ignoring the fear gripping my stomach, I looked at my surroundings. Some of these RVs, superficial dents aside, were beyond well built. So well built that someone stuck inside would not be able to get out easily if the door was blocked. And I had plenty of small landscaping tools still on my belt that I could easily jam a door handle if I was able to trick whoever was out there inside the RV. So I took a deep breath, switched off my flashlight and put together a plan. I had several minutes, but not much more. Whoever was out there would most likely go up and down the rows of RVs, looking for anything out of place. Naturally, an open door would signal that something was wrong and should be checked. Once the person driving was well inside the RV, I could slam the door shut and jam it so there would be no getting out. It was as good a plan as any, and I had to act fast. Thankfully, it wasn't hard to decide on an RV. One of the giant expensive luxury vehicles was the way to go. But even in the dim light, the vehicle's interior was beyond impressive when I briefly checked it. No doubt no expense had been spared from the interior's comfort to the basic strength of the vehicle, which included windows, all of which were in perfect condition, without a single scratch on them. The RV also had the perfect main door, with a metal handle similar to a refrigerator's. If I were to put my small trowel from my belt inside the handle's space when the door was closed, it would jam the door perfectly, and it was the only door in and out of the vehicle. No normal doors to the front or passenger seat. I also was beyond thankful that this RV, like several on display, were built with plenty of space for me to crawl under and wait. So once I had carefully opened the door to lure in whoever was out here with me, I removed the small trowel from my belt and crawled under the middle of the RV as quietly as possible and waited. All those years crawling around bushes and hedges would definitely come in handy now as I ducked under the bumper and stared up at the RV. I had barely gotten in place when I heard the tyres on gravel stop. Then all was quiet while I was alone with my thoughts. The silence in the space was so thick it was unpleasant, and I felt like my heart was thudding painfully loud as I tried to listen. After what felt like an hour, I heard it. The sound of quiet footsteps coming my way. I swallowed thickly as I listened and got ready to act as soon as it was time. The footsteps quietly shuffled around before they arrived at the RV I was hidden under. As the footsteps got closer, I could tell whoever they belonged to was carrying a flashlight as well, as the beam slowly bobbed along to remind me someone was getting closer until the beam was right beside me. I couldn't see who the footsteps belonged to or make out any details aside from some basic black leather boots. But as they moved one step closer, I could faintly see the figure's outline in the reflection from one of the RV's tyre rims, and I could see they were wearing a belt with a large knife on it. My throat clenched as I stared at them from no more than a few feet away. The stranger was painfully close as I laid there, and silently willed whoever was out there to just take the few steps inside the RV. And moments later, the adrenaline in my body kicked up a notch as the boots walked the few steps forward into the open RV. I could feel the RV moving slightly under the weight of its new occupant as the stranger climbed aboard, stepped inside, and slowly began to look around. Despite the fear churning in my stomach, I did feel better that the stranger didn't immediately summon a friend of his who had driven here with him when he saw the open RV door. That meant this was the only other person here. So once the figure slowly started walking towards the bathroom and master bedroom in the back of the RV, that was time for me to climb out and spring into action. With my heart pounding harder than ever before in my life, I crept out from under the RV, took the trowel in hand, and gently grabbed the door handle while listening carefully. Whoever was in there had no idea I was out there, as I could feel the weight of footsteps in the back bedroom. So I carefully closed the door, which closed with a quiet click before I immediately jammed the trowel in the handle and made sure it was stuck. It was. The stranger inside had no idea what happened, but it didn't take whoever was inside long to realize something had happened, because moments later footsteps were hastily walking towards the door before there was weight pushing on it from the other side. It didn't give an inch, and some faint relief flooded through my body. I crept quietly away, as whoever was trapped inside tried to apply more pressure to the door, and nothing changed. As I put more distance between the RV and myself, I thought I could hear a muffled yell from inside, but that was it. I didn't stop walking away from the RVs, and before long, I had reached the other side of the open space and found myself facing a wall of trees. There was still no sign that whoever was stuck in the RV had managed to make any progress at all. With that hopeful thought, I took several more steps and finally reached the part of the woods that was well on the other side from where I had climbed out of the abandoned mine. When I finally walked through the trees and was lost in them moments later, I finally felt somewhat better, but I kept my flashlight off to avoid being detected, and I carefully crept along, listening carefully for any sound of movement or voices. As I continued walking in the trees, I heard a second vehicle roaring up from the other side of the area. I immediately ducked behind a tree and turned to watch. Someone had driven into the area via a truck, and the driver wasted no time getting out and racing into the vast collection of RVs their shoes echoing loudly on the hard floor. I had a pretty good idea what would happen next, and I was right. Because although I couldn't see anything yet, I could hear the RV door being yanked open before it was slammed shut. Then, when both people walked quickly back towards the truck, which still had its headlights on, I could see, and I got a good look at the person who unknowingly walked right past me. He was a tall guy, muscular, and if I had to guess, I'd say mid-30s. His partner fit the same description. "What happened?" one of them asked the other. "I don't know. I went inside to see what made the door open, and before I knew it, it was sealed shut and I couldn't get out. Just like I told you. Well, it was sealed shut with this. I could faintly see him holding up my trowel that was available at any store for a few bucks. And there's no telling who's responsible for it and where they are. We'll just have to take it from here." "Right." Then I watched as they both got in the truck and roared out of there in the opposite direction from me. I let out a big sigh of relief before I kept walking. I knew I would eventually reach a road, but every step was tinged with nerves, as I half expected someone lurking behind a tree to reach out and attack me. But after about 2 hours, I managed to reach a road without incident, and when I saw it, I finally had reception to call for help. I immediately told the police what I'd seen, and they dispatched someone to find me while the dispatcher stayed on the line with me. And I'd never been more relieved in my life than when I saw the flashing lights of the police car coming towards me. I described the general direction I'd come from, but it didn't take long for the cops to find the place, because after I left, someone had set fire to all the RVs, and before long, everything there was burning intensely, and the smoke was visible for miles. They had to bring in a massive team of firefighters to calm the blaze down, and they were able to get the fire under control in time for the cops to find out that all the RVs that hadn't been totally burned were all listed as missing along with their owners. The cases involved spanned many years in every region of the country. After some time, the cops were able to use some of what was found at the RV collection to aid in solving some missing persons cases, but there was never any lead on who was responsible for it, nor did they ever figure out what the specific motivation was. As for me, I'll always be extra careful where I step while on a landscaping job from now on. The Jacksons felt horrible when they heard what happened and gave me a huge bonus for my work that day. They were even gracious enough to invite me over for when they gave out Halloween candy. Since they stuck to sitting out on the front porch with some hot apple cider, I happily accepted. Still, I would like to know, what are your thoughts on it? Why would there be a bunch of random RVs, most of which were connected to missing people? Has anyone experienced or known of this phenomenon before? Please let me know.